Hello and welcome to another folio. Over the years we've been very conscious in this programme that only on rare occasions do we deal with one important element in our cultural life, that is writing in the Irish language. The reasons are perhaps obvious enough, that folio is after all an English language programme. There are Irish language programmes. My own modicum of Irish wouldn't be adequate. And maybe even some people find macaronic programming irritating rather than helpful. Despite all this, there are times when literary activity in Irish does break into our English-speaking consciousness, does seem to knock at the doors of our awareness. And it well may be that now is such a time, and that in one particular area of creativity, poetry written in Irish, something has been happening that deserves attention in both languages. A new grouping of poets has appeared that suggests perhaps there is a new flowering in Irish writing, some kind of small renaissance, perhaps. It's against this background of, as it were, modernity, some kind of newness, that we see a recent publication by the highly respected and traditional poet Máirtín Ó Direáin, a 75-year-old Aran Island man. He has expressed his pleasure that this new volume of selected poems by him, with facing translations, has for each poem an accompanying translation, and they are by Tomás Mac Síomóin and Douglas Hyde. Tomás a poet, Douglas Hyde a critic. Douglas, it's worth remembering, I think, that your own grandfather, Douglas Hyde, scholar, poet, translator, and of course the first president of our country, published in 1903 a bilingual volume of translations from the blind poet Raifteiri. Now we have this volume of Ó Direáin. You know, that's 70 or 80 years later. In the meanwhile, I don't think there's been any bilingual collection of any poet. Isn't this remarkable?
Yes, that is true. I think that history is repeating itself, because my grandfather produced most of his early books bilingually, because he knew that half or whatever of the population would not understand. And now I think there is a growing realization that in spite of all that has been done for the Irish language, the number of people who actually understand what is written is not getting any bigger, and possibly decreasing. And the time has now come to put Irish poetry back into the English language.
And to allow writing in Irish seep out into an English consciousness.
Yes, so that the Irish poets can influence writing in English.
And this is why you and your colleague, Mac Síomóin, translated Ó Direáin, whom you regard as a highly important poet.
Yes, he's a milestone, or perhaps a boundary mark between the old and the new.
Is he the end of the old?
Yes, he was the end of the old. But in fact, before him there was a lot of old stuff, but it was all pastiche. He has managed to be old and new at the same time. But he's not a pioneer or a forerunner. He's just there. He's a gigantic monument.
And of course, unlike the new poets now, he was a monoglot and spoke only Irish on the islands until he was 15 or 16, I think.
That is one of his great strengths.
Gaelic published a recording of Ó Direáin himself reading his poems in Irish, of course, a little while ago, and let's hear now one of them, which is called Sic Transit.
Glán vig haig na flá, fui raibh na hileán hir, cú céad bliain go léir. Síol bhríon na néocht, an pór teán tréan, cá bhfuil i nead cré. Na flá I bhris réim, a chuine gionn hain, den talamh garbh gán, céad a céad bliain dá níos. Jouw de relic was er eil, Liabawolish is a nyad.
Sic Transit. Clown Vig Haig, the lords who ruled the Western Islands for all of 500 years, offspring of the great Brian, that firm, strong stock. Where is their nest of clay? The lords who broke their sway, who kept their own parcel of the rough, scanty soil for the next 400 years. In a graveyard upon a cliff you'll find the bed and nest of their kin. Their burial ground is by the bay, beside the strand of the heads. A coat of arms is graved on the tomb, and a slogan on the slab above. A slogan that bears the O'Flaherty's challenge, Fortuna favit fortibus. But rust is gnawing at the rail. Rust is talking with an old coach in the yard of the big house still. No one mentions the lords or their fame in their ancestral home or in Kilcolmon, since the last O'Flaherty went to join the rest of his kin in the grave beside the strand.
Douglas Seeley there reading an elegy by Máirtín Ó Direáin for the Lords of Arran. Owen O'Hanlon, you lecture in Irish University College. Douglas was saying there that Ó Direáin, while there are elements of modernity in him, he's clearly aware of 20th century poetry, although he wouldn't have been in his earlier decades. He is still part of it. He is a watershed, and something may be happening among younger poets now which is significant and which may be some sort of new renaissance, something, as Douglas was saying, that resembles the mood in which his grandfather was translating so long ago.
Yes, I think Máirtín Ó Direáin is unique, and he stands between the poetry of the 30s and then the renaissance that happened in the 40s and the 50s. I think that by the end of the 60s he had written his best poetry, and in a way it was, I would imagine, a reaction against Máirtín Ó Direáin that some of these younger poets began to write. They found that while he had made a tremendous impact himself, that somehow or other his mind was removed from their present experiences of the late 60s. And the late 60s was a particular time in modern Irish history. It's the 60s we all talk about. And there happened to be a remarkable generation of young people interested in literature in UCC at that time. Among those, the poets were
in University College Cork.
In University College Cork. That's Michael Davitt, Liam O'Muirtile, Nolan O'Connell, and there were others. But these are the three who have persistently applied themselves to the craft of poetry. And these three recent books, Tinach Nav and Bligard Sráide and Fair Sonseach, are the result of a commitment to poetry and to a poetic way of life. In Cork at that time, for instance, Sean O'Riordan came in as a resident poet, and he met these and encouraged them. Sean O'Toma was Professor of Irish and was also a writer himself. And the experiments of Sean O'Riordan in music and the enthusiasm that he was creating with everything concerned with Irish culture, that was the atmosphere, and also it was the freedom of the 60s, of the late 60s. It was out of that these poets began to write. And I remember at the time realising, when I was editing Core around the late 60s, that I was aware of something coming to an end. I felt that Ó Direáin perhaps had written himself out, and so had Máire Vacanty to some extent, and so had Sean O'Riordan, although did still go on.
There was some vacuum.
Producing. But I remember the excitement in receiving letters from Michael Davitt and Liam O'Muirtile and Gabriel Rosenstock and others, Nolan O'Connell, offering me poems, asking me to review them or at least read them and give an opinion on them. And I knew instinctively that there was a new movement afoot. Not exactly a movement or a school, but that there were poets, definitely poets, writing.
And all of these published in a magazine called Inti in recent years.
Well, they wrote to me first in Core, but obviously one could only publish a certain amount, and they were young people in a hurry, and they wanted to get their poems published, so they went about establishing Inti, first of all as a broadsheet and then appearing as a magazine, and that has been the main vehicle for their poetry, and it's been an amazing contribution to Irish cultural life generally, apart from the writing in Irish.
Oh, and thank you.